Hey guys, welcome back to Rash Decision. If you're enjoying the content, please leave me a like and subscribe. Let me know. Today we're actually going to do the start of a very, very short three-part series. It's just going to be like maybe small videos where I'm going to kind of go over a little bit of information that I've been asked to go over. Maybe based off of prior videos or user comments, and that's going to include this game that we're looking at right here. We'll go over it in just a moment. As well as Forza Horizon. I won't be doing like much racing, but I will be doing a little bit of driving around, just kind of showing what I mean about the suspension tuning and how to do suspension tuning and what it actually means in the real world, as well as SnowRunner. And SnowRunner is actually going to be sort of the same thing, but it's going to be showing how I created mods in order to modify how trucks are balanced against each other. So that's actually going to be another part of this. But this one is a game called Automation. You may have heard of it, you may not have. This is a game that's been in production for over 10 years. It's been in early access for over 10 years. I was a early backer of this game long before it came to Steam. More than 10 years ago. I've actually been having a lot of trouble placing exactly when I first saw this game because I was a backer for it when it was just its own website sitting off by itself. So this will actually be a fixture on this channel eventually. This game is designed to be a car company tycoon. I will eventually be playing this game for its campaign for this channel. But for today, we're not going to do that. I'm actually just going to jump into the engine designer right here to kind of talk about what I want to talk about using this game. So instead of having to jump around to like different example videos and having to step on like the toes of a lot of other YouTubers, I'm actually going to use automation to show how torque and horsepower interact within an engine. So I did have a request from a viewer to talk about this sort of thing in relation to like Forza, in relation to like SnowRunner, how to think about that sort of thing in simulation games, especially. And we're going to go ahead and I'm going to go into a new engine right here, and we'll get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just build just the most basic four-cylinder that you would see in 2024. And let's see, we're going to grab, I'm just going to do some real basic stuff right here. I'm going to do light aluminum. It's going to be a 2-liter. We're not going to do anything different there. You can think of how many liters are in cc's, because 1,000 cc's or cubic centimeters is 1 liter. That's actually part of the reason why, even though I'm using imperial measurements for the bore and stroke, I'm using metric for the total displacement right here. So let's see, if we go to, I'm going to do just a standard overhead cam. We'll just do 2 valves, just keep it simple for right now. Aluminum head. So what it's talking about here, an inline engine has, if I hover over it, you can actually see how the internal workings of that are operating. An inline engine just has all the pistons right in a line. A V engine is going to have the pistons in this V shape like this. So this one is a 60 degree, this one is a 90 degree. These will have their own use because these that geometry will change how the engine operates in general. And of course, a boxer is also referred to as a flat. So there's a flat 6, flat 4, there's up to a V10 in the 90 degree. And there is a reason that the 12 is over here and the 10 is over here. Like you always will have to have even on V's, and you can have different variations when you're talking about inline. Like you can have a 5-cylinder inline, and of course you can have the inline 6 and that sort of thing. So we're just going to go with inline 4. We're going to leave it 2 liters. We're going to make it all aluminum. The block is what they're talking about, like right here. The head is this up here. The head is kind of what controls the input, output for air and exhaust. And the block is what kind of identifies the primary strength of the engine. So we're going to kind of move forward. Actually, you know what? I'm going to set the quality to 5 just because it will show what's going on here a lot easier. So for the crank, I'm just going to do a forged steel crank. Let's see. Let's do forged control rods and forged Yeah, we'll probably just do forged light pistons because it's not going to make any difference for this engine. I'm just going to make a very, very basic, just a simple engine right here that I can show. Oops, that I can show what's going on. The compression identifies how little space is going to be left between the top of the piston and the bottom of the head at the very top dead center of the piston. So when the piston is at the bottom of its stroke and it pushes up and it compresses all that fuel and air, the compression ratio identifies how much air volume is being pushed into a tiny space. So the higher that is, it's going to be a smaller space, it's greater compression. The larger or the smaller this number is, it's going to be a larger space at the top of that piston, which will mean less compression. These will have different uses for going both directions. It's not always a good thing just to crank this all the way up. The cam profile identifies what shape the camshaft is. We'll kind of come back to that one because we will be using this one to show a difference right here very shortly. The springs and lifters, I'm not going to mess with this one because that's very fine tuning that we're not going to get into here. I am going to turn this one on. This one's called variable valve timing. Variable valve timing is, let's see, I don't remember exactly the wording I should be using here, but basically you can think of it as the camshaft is used in different ways throughout the RPM band to create the most power possible. Usually it would be like, it could be in ways like this, the variable valve line. The variable valve line will usually have like multiple camshafts, and it will actually move the one camshaft over into a position physically with like a hydraulic or electronic force. But I've never really been a fan of those systems, so I almost never use the VVL. And usually I'll just stick to my variable valve timing because that is a much more simple mechanical process that doesn't have a lot of failure points. Not to say that VVL does, I just don't like the way the VVL functions in the real world. So I usually try to avoid it when I'm building my engines, and that's usually a really good way to keep costs down and keep the engine operating smoothly anyway. So we'll kind of move along from there. But the purpose of this video, again, is more to just talk about the torque versus horsepower and kind of show the differences and use the graph here that it creates as a talking point. So we'll kind of just speed along here and not try to explain every little thing anymore. Let's see, so the fuel system, electronic fuel injection, carburetor versus injection has been a hot topic for a long, long time because there have been reports of carburetors that were created by specific inventors that have supposedly been squashed by big oil or purchased out or if you really want to put it on a tinfoil hat, made to disappear because they created a carburetor that got like 100 miles per gallon. But really, it's a lot more complicated than just the carburetor or just the injection. We know that injection is a lot better at managing the fuel that goes into the engine, so that's what I'm going to use because it's a known value that I know I can work with. So I'm going to go through. Actually, I'm not going to use the compact because that one's a little bit weird. I'm going to use the standard mid for the intake manifold, and I'm not going to really go too much into what the differences between those are. Just know that the intake is what takes air into the engine and distributes it evenly throughout the cylinders as they need it. So let's see, the fuel requirement. This has to do with the octane. So you can think of 91. RON is a different type of octane measurement than we use in the US. In the US, you can consider this to be like 91 RON, you can consider it to be like 87 pump gas. And then we would have like 91 pump gas, and then 93 would be premium. But in RON, you're talking about 95 being the equivalent of 91, and then 98 would be the equivalent of our 93. At least if I remember correctly, that's how that works. But we're going to go ahead and set it to regular, so that it'll be just regular pump gas coming out of anything that you want to, any gas station you want to pull into. So let's see, make sure I got everything here. I did. Okay. So the headers are the exhaust headers that go on this side that kind of help exhaust move out of the engine. There's a lot of science to exhaust headers and how they can affect what's called exhaust scavenging to help the engine be more efficient. So there's a lot of things going into this, but luckily I really like these guys because they did actually manage to distill headers into like some very, very simple clicks right here that don't really make a whole lot of difference and don't overload you with information. And I'm not going to either. Basically, I'm just going to go with a cast bid, and we're going to call it at that. Going to the header size. I don't need to modify this. We will come back after we get the engine completed, and I might do some like fine tuning just to pull some extra power out of it, but not right now. So I'm just going to use a standard high flow three-way. This is what you would expect on like a standard modern car. So we're going to start with this one. These two down here, they are more advanced, but we're not going to bother with them because the pre-catalytic, that's a little bit more fancy than I really want to put on this engine. And we're just going to do a reverse flow and a reverse flow. These are very modern options as well. Reverse flow exhaust is exactly what you would expect to pull off of a car that had this engine in it. And I'm going to do two of them to keep the engine kind of quiet so that it's not like super, super loud. This is more like a kind of unutilized octane. I'll fix that in just a moment. Oops. Reverse flow is exactly what you would expect to find, especially two of them on like a standard passenger car. So if you went out and bought like a 2004 Cavalier, this is what you're going to find underneath it. Let's see. So unutilized octane. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to go down here, and I'm actually just going to turn up the compression. I'm pretty sure the compression is going to go pretty high if I do this. Has some unutilized fuel octane. So the next thing I'm going to do then, we'll go ahead and we'll turn this up just a little bit, give it a little bit of a tail over here. I'm actually going to go down here to the fuel map, and I'm going to make it a little bit more lean. That will also use up some of that octane. And what octane is actually doing, I don't remember if I mentioned it here or if I mentioned it elsewhere, but octane is resistance to auto ignition. So when an engine is moving really, really fast and it's compressing all that fuel-air mixture, when you compress that, it creates heat. And of course, as you know, when you take heat and you apply it to an explosive substance, it's going to explode. That's what autoignition means. It's igniting itself based on the heat that's being generated by the engine from attempting to squeeze all that together. So if you use less fuel, it reduces the chances of autoignition. And additionally, if you notice, even though I'm reducing the fuel that's going into the engine, this line is still steadily going ever so slightly up. And that's because I'm utilizing the octane that's available to me in the fuel. So I'm using more of the fuel's capability to produce power. I guess the way I meant to say that is I'm using more of the potential to produce power. So the engine is becoming more efficient. So it looks like that is actually starting to go down. So I'm going to move this back up a little bit. I still have some unutilized octane, so that's actually kind of interesting. I'm going to move over to this screen right here. So the intake manifold, I'm already over capacity, so I'm going to make this a little bit larger. And of course, there again, because I'm making the engine more efficient, it's moving those lines up just ever so slightly. Okay, so there we go. I'm under 100%. So that means that this engine will actually be able to move its air around very efficiently. And there again, because I've got that exhaust that's not doing too well, I'm going to make the exhaust slightly larger, and then I'm going to make the header. Looks like that header did not affect the way I thought it was going to. We will go ahead and move this up a little bit. There we go. So that looks like that has taken care of that issue. So now that the engine is at its peak efficiency, I've actually gained about 2 horsepower. And that has to do with, again, we're using the fuel to a more efficient level, and we don't have to worry about too much. But this is exactly what you would expect to see for a for your just bog standard, off the shelf, regular old car engine. This is a 2-liter, 4 inline, has about 130 horsepower, a little bit more, 130 foot-pounds of torque, and that foot-pounds of torque is almost exactly in the middle of that band, where you would actually be making power. So down here at the bottom, this is your idle at 1,000, and when you go up to here up the top where it has the peak torque, that is about the middle of where you would expect it to be. This thing, it maxes out. I've got it set to red line at 6,200. You're expecting around 2,200. Between 2,000 and 2,200 is where you would want to keep it for highway speed. So when I put the transmission onto this thing, I would want to gear it in such a way that it would stay around 2,200 or 2,000 for most of its time. And that's where it's going to be producing this much power. So if we look at that and we actually split the difference, or look at about 2,200, which is what I would normally aim for, even though this is a 130 horsepower engine, it's only producing about 50 horsepower in the range where I would expect it to be doing so. And if you look at that torque number, 114, 115 foot-pounds of torque, when an engine is operating at its peak efficiency threshold, it is almost never producing its maximum horsepower. That doesn't happen. So when you're talking about a tractor or an industrial engine, the reason the torque makes such a big difference is when you're operating down here, that horsepower is not moving very much weight. So you have to rely exclusively on your torque number in these ranges to really make up that difference. And when you're driving a tractor, 2,200 is very, very commonly the maximum that engine will go to begin with. So when you're talking about a 50 horsepower tractor, if we actually go up here and I kind of slide this up just ever so slightly, so there's 50 horsepower. Well, they're about, it's 2275 right there. 2275 makes 50 horsepower. So if I cut this engine off at 2275 RPM, and I installed this engine in a tractor, I could call it a 50 horsepower tractor because at its peak it makes 50 horsepower. And a lot of times when the tractor is operating at 2275, which it honestly it'll just go right to 2275, and you can just keep it there the entire time and just let the transmission do the work for moving that power to the wheels. That 50 horsepower doesn't really mean too much when you don't have a whole lot of power that's available to you from that range. The 50 horsepower will absolutely move weight. You have to remember that horsepower is almost arbitrary. It is a measurement of moving a specific amount of weight, a specific distance, over a specific time. So when one of those variables changes, the other two kind of have to adjust, and you can still come out to the same result. So if you say that 1 horsepower can move, I believe it's 10 pounds over 10 feet, something like that. So when you have 50, you can say 50 horsepower can move 50 pounds over 10 feet over 10 seconds or what have you. But I don't remember if that's exactly how it works. It might be the 10-10-10 rule. I don't exactly remember the formula is, but the point being, when you increase your horsepower, you can decrease the other two numbers, or if you decrease your horsepower, you simply increase the other two numbers. But it's basically arbitrary for that reason. It's not exactly a measurement of anything very, very specific with how an engine operates in general, because you're modifying how little horsepower you have down here. If you push that throttle, you can get up to here. And in fact, I can even show you what we mean by that. So your throttle sits down here normally, and if you notice that when your throttle is down here, it doesn't have access to a whole lot when it starts moving through its RPM band. But if we actually push the throttle, and in fact, when I move this slider, you can imagine this very, very literally as me pushing the pedal further towards the floor. So if we move this throttle up, we notice that we now have more access to power, but it still is not as much as you would expect up here at the very, very top. So even if we go to like half throttle or like 3/4 throttle, it still doesn't quite match everything. This dynograph measures what the engine is capable, what this capable of doing at full throttle, what's called wide open throttle. And wide open actually means that when you push the throttle, it will actually actuate. There's a little plate inside of here that is turned by this little lever right here. When it's sitting at closed throttle or no throttle, it is actually completely vertical. That plate inside of there is completely vertical. It's blocking 99% of that airflow from going into this chamber. And then as we move the throttle, it starts to bend backwards in the front and forwards in the bottom until we get to wide open throttle, at which point it's completely horizontal. It's not blocking anything whatsoever. And if you listen very closely, when I move that throttle, it will actually change how the engine sounds. So that's actually because more air is being introduced into the engine and greater power is able to be produced as the throttle goes up. So in the real world, this is kind of possible, but only in a setup like this. So this right here, this dynameter type actually pulls directly off the crankshaft and has the ability to not only read what's going on in the engine by reading the rotational forces applied to the shaft, it also can control what the engine does. So even though I've got full throttle and it should be speeding up and doing its own thing, this thing right here is controlling how much RPM it's allowed to push out. So the engine has plenty of air, has plenty of ability to make power, and those explosions are physically making power. This object over here is stopping it from moving faster so that we can measure what's going on with it. So I'm going to leave the throttle wide open, and if we just kind of move it up just a little bit, you can kind of hear the difference in when I do that versus like bottom throttle. So yeah, when you move through these bottom RPMs, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference because there's not enough air going into the engine to really produce a ton of power. So at this point, what we're going to talk about is the actual difference between torque and power and how they relate to what you're doing with the engine. So if I were to put a name on this engine and what it can do, I would say this is something you would put into a passenger vehicle, and you wouldn't really do much with it outside of that. And the reason for it is because the torque is generally very even with the horsepower. When you work into higher torque, such as on these graphs, the torque will be higher than the horsepower. Even though they're different measurements, the reason that they will go onto the same graph is to compare them. So the horsepower will generally stay alongside the torque, at least in imperial measurement. I will actually say that there are some some alternate imperial as well as some metric measurements that will have them different, and you kind of have to read them a little bit different. But the reason that these measurements were chosen for most imperial measurements is because it's easy to identify exactly what the power and torque relationship is on an engine, at least in this this layout. So when they're even like this, the simple way to think about it is it's probably not going to be useful for industrial applications, and that has a lot more to do with what's going on down here, but it also has to do with if you're putting something into a pickup, it's going to be very similar. Like, it's going to have your around 6,000, between 5 and 6,000 RPM range, so it's still going to have access to the RPM range that this type of engine would have, but you would still see like a significant difference in the torque. So actually what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change how this engine operates to begin with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually, you know what, we're actually going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to leave the engine exactly the same, and I'm just going to change it over to a carburetor. And there's a reason for that. I'm actually going to change it to a 2-barrel carburetor. And if you notice, the horsepower went down significantly, and the torque went up significantly, and it's dropping off at the bottom end. And the reason for that is that a carburetor doesn't deliver fuel as efficiently, but very importantly is that what fuel it does deliver is very rich. So even though I have it set very, very lean, because there's more fuel in that fuel-air mixture, it's creating a larger explosion and pushing down that piston much harder when it happens. So because that piston's being pushed down much harder, and there's not really a necessary a case to be made for the piston being pushed faster, just with more force, there's therefore more torque, because more force is being applied, but there's less horsepower because less work is actually being done with that power. So that's actually the big difference right there. So when we have down here at the bottom, if you notice, the torque is actually significantly improved. And if we actually go up to the 22 or around, about 2275, I believe is what it was, we haven't lost much power. That's the big difference, is your torque matters significantly more at those levels that a industrial application would use than your horsepower. And that actually makes a translation over to the physical implementation of that power as well. When you're at these low speeds, of course, you don't have very much power when you take off from a standstill. You only have 17 horsepower. That's barely more than a lawnmower. Remember that's barely more than a lawnmower. And a lawnmower actually, if you think about a lawnmower, a tractor, things that would have those kind of implementations, they actually do not use your standard gas pedal. You've never seen a push mower with a gas pedal on it, have you? No, you haven't. You see it with a lever for throttle, and you can push that lever all the way up, and it will stay at whatever RPM it is designated to stay at, or whatever it's governed to. Usually for a lawnmower, it's around 3,000 to 3,500 RPM, depending on who made it. So if you look at it like this, that's of course a much bigger number than this all the way down here. Whereas a dynamic throttle in like a car or a truck, something that's going to be moving the weight of like people or the weight of like cargo, things of that nature, it actually has to dynamically go through its RPM range for the purpose of, first off, reliability, but second off, the purpose of using the transmission to its fullest extent. So a transmission's job, therefore, is to be able to keep it in its primary torque and power range for as long as possible. So in this case, where we're looking at this engine where it has about 110 foot-pounds of torque, we would want to use a transmission that's going to keep it in this range of like 3,000 to 4,000, or give or take 2,000 to 4,000, for as long as possible, to make as much use of this upper portion of this curve as possible. So we would go from a standstill, we would start speeding up, and from here we're going to hit our highway speed, or at least our highway expectation. And from here, we're in first gear, we go past 2,000, we go to 4,000, and we're picking up speed, and we're picking up the power, even with all the weight that we're carrying, and we'll shift up. And then we'll go back down to 2,000, and we'll go up and up and up, we'll shift up. We'll go up and up and up, and we'll shift up, until we get to our final drive, which is usually either 5th or 6th gear, and we'll sit there at about right here. So the engine is not actually changing for what torque it's putting out, but the vehicle's transmission is changing what torque and what power is being used by the wheels. So when you're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio between the transmission, that the transmission is translating between the engine and the wheels, Well, usually, there's going to be like a differential and that sort of thing in between, but 1-to-1 quite literally means that there's no torque multiplication. So when you are at 2200 RPM for your highway speed, you're putting out 102 pound-feet of torque at all times. But as you go down in your gears, you're actually increasing the torque that's making it to the wheels. That's why when you start to go, like in first gear, you're actually going to feel significantly more torque than you would in your highway speed. So when you're at highway speed, you just stomp down the gas at 2200 RPM. You're not going to feel as much of a difference as if you did that in like first gear. So in first gear, usually it's around a 3-to-1, and I'm just using that as a very, very basic multiplier just to give an example. So at 2200 RPM in first gear, you're actually giving the wheels approximately 300 foot-pounds of torque, but significantly less horsepower. That's where actually one of the real-world examples of torque versus horsepower come in. So when you multiply your torque up, you can think of your horsepower going down because there's less work actually being done. When the engine is turning 3 times to turn the wheels once, that means that you need more rotations of the engine in order to turn those wheels, obviously. So you have 3 times the torque, but you have a third of the horsepower. A third of the work is actually being done. You're covering a third of the distance with the same horsepower, but you're doing so with much greater force. That is actually very, very useful for transmissions to be able to get your car up to speed, but also it's very useful to think about in the context of a truck moving a large amount of weight. So if we're trying to move a significantly larger weight than the engine might be even designed for, if we really want to put it that way, we can do so by using torque multiplication. We don't want it to get there super, super fast. It's not a race most of the time. But we do want to be able to get it off the line, and we do want to be able to get it down the road. So if we look down here at the very, very bottom when we're going to be taking off, 82 pound-feet of torque doesn't sound like a lot, but if we geared this down really, really, really far, like we're talking 10-to-1, suddenly we have 840 foot-pounds of torque. That means that all the wheels that are driving this vehicle, as long as they have traction against the ground, they are pushing with a total force of about 840 pounds for every foot from their fulcrum. So if you look at a tire, from the center of the tire to the outer rim of the tire, where it's meeting the ground, if we take a measurement of that, which usually a truck is going to be anywhere between 32 and 40 inches, give or take, for a total diameter for just a regular truck that's going to be transporting goods. If we take a 40, for example, that's just shy of 2 feet for the radius, and that radius is going to be our torque arm coming from the fulcrum, which is the center of the tire that's being driven by the axle. So just shy of 2 feet, you think about that, that's 20 inches. For simplicity's sake, we can say 1.5 if we're like talking about a 30-inch tire. So 1.5 pounds, so we could take that 840 and then multiply it again by another 50%. That's what, 860, 1260. 1,260 pounds of force are being applied to those wheels. They're not going to go very fast, obviously, but as long as they can apply that force to the ground to break that friction and get rolling, once you get rolling, you can then kind of slowly decrease your gear ratio until you get to the point where you can move at a highway speed. That's actually exactly what a transmission does. So if we're starting out with 1,260 foot-pounds of torque, I'm sorry, you're actually talking about 1.5 pounds of torque. If we're talking about 1,260 pounds of force being applied to the ground, that's quite a significant amount of force for moving just about any load. And that's going to break your friction against the ground. That's going to move everything forward. And then we can kind of row through our gears just like you would see in a large truck. Having 18 gears, obviously you can gear those very, very closely together. So now instead of when we go from first to second, we're now instead of 10 to 1, we're 9.5 to 1. And we can kind of slowly creep our way up through those gears until we can reach a speed that is manageable and in equilibrium between our speed and what weight we're carrying. So that's actually the difference between horsepower and torque, because in that entire conversation, horsepower didn't even enter the equation. We don't care how long it takes us to get to the speed we want to get to, as long as we get to it. That's what actually matters, is your horsepower becomes arbitrary completely when you start talking about moving enormous amounts of weight. So we're actually going to cut it off there. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Again, next video, we're going to be going into Forza, and I'm going to be showing you kind of how suspension works. And then and when we go into SnowRunner, we're going to kind of be putting those together in a real-world application, how torque and suspension kind of matter for just about everything when you're moving significant amounts of weight. And you need to talk about what the engineering behind it is in order to improve it. So we'll cut it off there. Have a good one, my guys. Cheers.